dais. I would start with Akhlaque Ahmad Ahan. Professor Ahan is a professor and chairperson of the Center of Persian and Central Asian Studies, JNU, New Delhi, and visiting professor at Oriental Institute, Tashkent, Uzbekistan. He specializes in the areas of Indo-Persian studies, Silk Road region, Sufism, Indian knowledge tradition, Amir Khusro, Dara Shikoh, Khayyam, Rumi, Bedil, modern Persian and Urdu Hindi literature. He pursued his education in India and Tehran. He has over 20 published books and about 100 research papers to his credit. He's a recipient of President of India's Maharishi Badrayan Vyas Samman, Saadi Award, Urdu Academy Award, Qazi Abdul Wudud Award, and International Iqbal Award from ICO, and many more. And next I introduce Saif Mahmood. Saif Mahmood, Mehfilon Ki Jaan. Saif Mahmood is an advocate of the Supreme Court of India, an international lawyer. He divides his times between India and UK, a visiting scholar in law at the University of Oxford. He's the author of the best-selling Beloved Delhi, A Mughal City and Her Greatest Poets, a book of its own kinds, unlike any on Delhi and its classical poets. I next introduce the author of the book, who needs no introduction, but the pressure of time is on me, so the schedule is in front of you. And before I introduce Professor Anisur Rahman and open the discussion, it's about the mobiles, that mobiles go silent, and now introduction about Professor Anisur Rahman, sir. Formerly a professor and head Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, he's published in the areas of comparative, translation, post-colonial, and Urdu studies. He has to his credit 6 books authored by him, 5 edited, co-edited volumes, and 3 collections of Urdu poetry in English translation. He has been a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada, and a visiting scholar at Purdue University, USA. Hazaar Rang Shaairi, The Wonderful World of the Urdu Nazm, is his latest work that was released a couple of months ago and is now receiving very encouraging responses. This book we are going to discuss now with the experts is a sequel to his earlier book, Hazaaron Khwahishein Aisi, The Wonderful World of Urdu Ghazals. So now, sticking to the time, I invite Professor Akhlaque Ahmad Ahan Sahab to begin his views on the book. Thank you.
Thanks and congratulations to Professor Anisur Rahman for publishing 2 books, Hazaar Rang Shaairi and Hazaaron Khwahishein Aisi. And with these 2 volumes introducing the almost the major portion or major corpus of Urdu poetry to the people who cannot read Urdu Khat so it is a great service to the Urdu literature itself. This is the work, the 2 volumes. The first work he has done is of Intakhab or the selection of poems and poets. And it is historically a very difficult work if we go into the history of selecting poets and poems. For example, in the medieval period, we have come across the terms like Bayaz, Safina, Jung, Kashkol. These are all the terms used for the selection of poems, sometimes prose writings also, sometimes the kind of one genres of poetry. And it has always been a challenge. For example, the great poets of India, for example, Amir Khusro and Bedil and Ghalib, and we see that they too were struggling to select or make an anthology of their own poetry. For example, Ghalib, a person like Ghalib, he was not only a poet but also a great literary critic, a great scholar. He did not do the work of selection. The Diwan-e Ghalib we are having and we read is just one portion of his whole poetry. Now the unpublished poetry is also published. So what he did, he asked his contemporary and a great scholar and friend Maulana Fazle Haq, and asked him to do the selection, and he accepted the selection, and it is now so in my understanding, selection of a poet and selection of the poetry of the poet is a great challenge, and it also plays a great role in introducing a poet's whole literary persona to the literary circles. So it is also a very important thing. Nobody goes to read the complete work of a poet. So the selection is always a very important thing. And there has been always disagreement. I cannot totally agree with the selection Anisur Rahman Sahib has done, and he will be explaining during his discussion what was the means grounds he has selected the poems of the many poets like Iqbal and many. And second, he has also discussed the genres of Urdu poetry. And I can also disagree with many points. He has debated about the genres of the poetry, but at the same time, also because there is no agreement in Urdu discussions about this classification of the genres. There is always a debate whether it should be divided or classified on the ground of theme or the form. So for example, but he has, I must underline that Professor Anisur Rahman has very aptly and comprehensively, yet briefly, has done this work, introducing the whole genre of Urdu poetry, and divided the nazm, the poems of Urdu poetry of last many centuries. So that is very important, and it also opens a kind of understanding and debate among the scholars of the Urdu. And I think it is really good that you have taken like religious representation, hamd, munajat and all, and so at one point we can agree is that Urdu poetry can largely be classified into two portions. One is the ghazal poetry and another is non-ghazal poetry. So he has taken in this volume of Hazaar Rang Shaairi the non-ghazal poetry. About the nazm, when we call upon the nazm or we discuss about the genre of nazm, we are reminded of generally the modern wave of Urdu poetry. There is one thing also that I must talk about it, that during the last 100 years, if we take into account, that is or around 130, 40 years, that is also the era of Urdu nazm or Urdu poems, is when we see it, why I call it era of Urdu nazm, because during this period the most prominent poets of Urdu poetry are the poets of nazm. For example, it is Iqbal or Noon Mim Rashid or Faiz or Akhtarul Iman. They are the most prominent poets of this era. Hali, and they are all the poets primarily the poets of the nazm. But at the same time, the interesting aspect is that during this period which I am mentioning, if you will take into account the volume of the poetry composed in Urdu, again, the more than 80% of the poetry is the ghazal poetry. So that is also very interesting part of it. Uh, Second thing is that, which I should also underline, is the emergence of Urdu Nazm also coincides with the intellectual rising or intellectual debates or intellectual waves in the society, maybe political, socio-cultural, or whatever. It coincides with that. For example, the earliest, for example, the earliest poet, the major poet of the Nazm in Urdu is Nazir Akbar Abadi. And I think he, in a way, is associated with a subaltern kind of debate. He talks about Holi, he talks about Roti, he talks about the common people, and he is not recognized. He is recognized almost after 150 years by Kalimuddin Ahmad. Then you see the Aligarh movement. It is a major intellectual movement, educational movement in Aligarh, and the leading intellectuals are associated with that, and the leading Urdu poets are also associated with the same movement. For example, in a way you can say indirectly Muhammad Hussain Azad, Hali, he wrote Musaddas-e-Hali that also influenced Hindi poetry as well. That again, after that we see another movement in the 20th century, and in the poets, and the progressive movement. So the leading poets are associated with the progressive movement. For example, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, my own teacher Sardar Jafri, Kafi, Jazbi, and many others are associated with that. Then almost followed by it, we see Halqa Arbab-e-Zawq, Adab Barai Adab. So it is also a kind of intellectual debate we see into. So the interesting history of Urdu Nazm is associated with the intellectual debate of the society, Indian society. But I would like to also mention one thing, that when I say the intellectual debate is attached with the Urdu Nazm or the rise of the Urdu Nazm, but there is one exception to that. In the whole Indo-Persian history, not only in the Urdu poetry, but in the whole Indo-Persian poetry, we see two persons coming, and then they are great poets of Indo-Persian poetry, Indo-Persian ghazal. One is Bedil and another is Ghalib. Ghalib is also in a way his successor, literary successor of Bedil. These two poets, in the whole history of Persian poetry as well, I can say as a student of Persian, they are the two poets who also discuss or they have brought the intellectual or philosophical debate into ghazal poetry. So this is also one exception to that. But and the contemporary scenario, when we come to, I may say that, and as a whole, Urdu poetry or Urdu as a literary language, I may say that it is still a teenage. It has to grow a lot, and the contemporary scenario is that uh, since the language somehow attached with one identity, and it is rather ghettoized with the one identity, and we see a lack of intellectual debate in the contemporary scenario. So we also see the fall of Urdu Nazm. So thank you. Thanks a lot.